Hello everybody, welcome back to another talk. Let's talk about corruption. Now, when I said the word corruption, something immediately came to your mind. For many Americans, for example, this could be the Supreme Court, where a few members of the Supreme Court have not been disclosing very expensive vacations they've been receiving from large-scale Republican donors, right? And I'm calling this corruption specifically because they're legally required to report vacations of that financial amount, and they have not been, which there's only one real reason you wouldn't disclose such vacations. But that's what occurred to a lot of Americans who heard the word corruption. Congress is another example. A lot of people will think of the various congressional hearings for various businesses, which have ultimately resulted in nothing. The TikTok hearing being the more recent one, where everyone and their brother knew it was the result of the lobbying of several social media companies that got TikTok into the most meaningless and embarrassing congressional hearing in the history of Congress, to be really honest. And that's technically legal corruption because it was lobbying, and lobbying is legal, but let's be really honest, lobbying is just legalized corruption. And then we've got, of course, maybe if you are a minority in America, you perhaps thought of your local police with their biases against minorities. An interesting form of corruption that not a lot of people really talk about. A lot of people just say, for example, call it racism and leave it at that, but it's technically a form of corruption. We're talking about biases against a specific group of people or biases for a particular group of people in an organization that's supposed to be neutral, right? To go back to both Congress and the Supreme Court, for the case of the Supreme Court, this is a favoritism towards Republican views from a group that should be politically neutral, right? Congress is favoring certain businesses or business entities over others due to corruption. Legalized corruption, again, I want to make that clear, but police exerting racism or favoritism towards one group over others when they're supposed to be a socially neutral group, another form of corruption. This extends to the military, which has a lot of right-wing extremists and a bit of a problem. I say that I understate that, but a bit of a problem with more radical ideologies. Same thing in the military. Besides, of course, that, which would also bring the military to mind to people who heard the word corruption, who survived the military. We've also got the corruption of abuse of power as well, right? And trading of favors between officers and getting to the top and everything, which exists in most power structures. My point here is that corruption is rarely in the form fiction depicts it as. Works of fiction typically depict corruption as somebody in power being paid off to do something specific, and that does absolutely happen. A great example would be the lack of gun control laws thanks to heavy lobbying and probably illegal under-the-table payments to the Democratic Party by the NRA. Again, I've mentioned this before and I'll say it again. It's smart of the NRA. It's smarter for the NRA to publicly pay the Republicans and privately pay the Democrats, right? It's just a smart move. But while that type of corruption does exist, you could even argue that the unreported vacations to Supreme Court justices, is a form of that, because there's a financial value there. A lot of corruption, while still ultimately interested in money, isn't a payment by a third party. And even that corruption that isn't necessarily payment by a third party still serves the interest of another party. Corruption is very specifically serving the interests of a group that category is entrusted with, right? Let me take a really interesting example here. Scientific research, especially in psychology. It's recently been quite the hullabaloo in the psychological research area of some researchers faking data. Alright, I'm not going to get into the details here because it's a bit complex. And there's a couple of different instances of this. A couple of Harvard's researchers have been caught up in this, just to kind of give you an idea of the level at which we're talking about. But, I mean, even with... this hasn't exactly been unknown. I mean, a couple of years ago, we uncovered the fact that the Stanford Prison Experiment's results were completely fabricated, and that the Stanford Prison Experiment did not happen the way it was described. And a lot of people, when talking about scientific research, unless they're in the scientific community or they've gone really out of their way to research this, don't really understand why this happens. Alright, now I only really know this happens. I only myself discovered a scientific corruption, which is what I'm going to call this, way back in my college days, when I came up upon this in some unrelated research. Not psychological research, obviously. It was a general informational piece on educational corruption, I guess you could say, when I was preparing to make my thesis, my graduating thesis, and I had a little talk with my advisor who reminded me to not invent data. And so I looked into this, because of course I'm like, why would I invent data, and how common is this that you specifically warned me? It was, a kind of generic, and don't forget, don't invent data. Wait a minute. But it turns out it's not that unusual for people to invent data, but not at the thesis level. Some people do, and I'll get to that in a second, but generally speaking, this is going to be any kind of research that is done to acquire a tenured position. See, fun fact about tenured positions, and this depends to some extent college by college, university by university, but in order to be tenured, or to basically become a permanent fixture as an instructor at a university, you have to be published in some piece of media that's relevant to your field. For example, if you are looking to teach economics, you would need to have a couple of papers published in an economic magazine or something like that, an economic newsletter or something like that. Same thing for psychological research. You would need a couple of things published in, for example, Psychology Today or something like that. You would need to be a authored researcher. Your research must make the quote-unquote front pages of the big news pieces in your field, right? And I brought up the economics specifically to indicate how widespread this can really be. It's not just like the usual sciences. It can be something even as not perceived as science, but it is, like economic sciences, right? The point here is that the research, in order to get published, has to be interesting and exciting, right? The more interesting your result is, the more likely it is to be published. And once you're published, you get tenured, you get benefits, right? And as a result, in order to get published, a lot of quote-unquote researchers will face this temptation to create a wild thesis and test it and fudge the data if it doesn't go the way they want. Or, alternatively, which is actually more common, they'll keep testing it until they get an extreme result and publish that, ignoring the hundreds or possibly even thousands of trials it took them to get this one piece of really extreme result. Okay? This is why replication is so important in research. If a thesis or a result, specifically a result, can't be replicated by other people, it's probably fraudulent. Okay? This is, for example, one of the reasons why you're always hearing... Well, this is one of the reasons why you're always hearing what is good for you and what isn't changing all the time. Are trans fats good? Are trans fats bad? Are carbs good? Are carbs bad? Who the hell knows? I'll tell you who knows. Nobody. Because not only is research more likely to be corrupt on the thesis level to get published to get tenure, but a lot of research is also funded by not uninterested parties. A while back, I believe it was like 2018, but it could have been 2019. Researchers came up with the claim that cows are increasing global warming due to the methane gas from their farts. And if you were environmentally conscious, you wouldn't drink cow's milk. Right? Thus came the coincidental rise of such wonderful chemical cocktails as oat milk. By the way, look at the ingredients of oat milk, and don't forget to pick your jaw up off the floor. And I also dare you to pronounce any of those. But anyways, turns out that scientific claim, and I use the term scientific as loosely as possible here, was the research for that was funded by Oatly, which just happened to make oat milk made from oats. So if you stop drinking cow's milk and you need a substitute, lo and behold, here's oat milk to replace it. Have a nice short life. Anyways, all research is funded, unless it's a thesis. Well, it's still funded even if it's a thesis, but it's not necessarily funded by companies. But unless a piece of research is for a thesis paper for tenure or something, which, again, as I have already covered, covers its own levels of corruption, find out what's funding that research. Okay? This is why whenever people tell me that cows are bad for the environment, I laugh at them, because that research has been funded by people who really don't want you to consume cow products, basically. Beef, milk, something. Right? That research is funded by people trying to sell you something. Okay? A lot of people wonder, as a somewhat related note, a lot of people wonder why veganism is as widespread as it is, right? This was not something that was thought about as much 100 years ago, and some vegans will say, well, we've advanced as a society. Quite frankly, we barely have, to be really brutally honest. Technology has advanced, but that's about it. People don't change. People as a species don't change. We're still the same types of people that existed 100 years ago. So what changed? Well, I'll tell you what changed. Advertising. Companies pushing the idea that eating animals is bad because morals, and you shouldn't eat animals, you should be vegan because we can charge you more for vegan goods, even though they're made out of cheaper chemicals, right? If you're really vegan for moral reasons, that's up to you, but just be aware of the fact that you might have been influenced by that on that decision, alright? There are people interested in selling you vegan goods at a higher price, and that's not coincidence. Back to the point, though. This idea that scientific research is unbiased or even accurate is not nearly as true as a lot of people think. Alright, if you can't find the funding source for a piece of research, or that piece of research cannot otherwise be replicated, there's a good chance it's fraudulent. Even if people with genuine degrees came up with it, a degree does not mean they're honest. Okay? Incidentally, by the way, if you see a think tank connected with anything, it's almost guaranteed to be a lie, because all think tanks are funded by somebody. The government, corporations, whoever, right? There's no such thing as an unbiased think tank. A lot of think tank members will be upset if they hear this, obviously, but it's true. Alright, if you see the words think tank, laugh and move on, because there's no way in hell that that research is unbiased. There's an angle there, alright? Newsflash. Because all think tanks are funded. You can find that funding very easily as well. Think tanks have to be public with who's funding them, so it's not really difficult to find who's funding what think tank. As long as you have the name of the think tank, you've pretty much got a quick Google search away from finding who's funding them. And then from there, you have their angle. It's really easy. If you ever see a think tank, just highlight that think tank's name and do the right-click Google search thing. Boom, you find the funding. It's going to be one of the top results really quick. They'll usually have a website, and you can usually find their funding from there. But, yeah, think tanks, all of them are biased. Another form of corruption. But that's not a form of corruption a lot of people think about, because not a lot of people connect scientific research with corruption. Especially since a lot of people, when they think of scientific research, they think about the good old days with, like, Einstein and Tesla and things like that. And you might wonder, well, what happened? Well, to be really honest, scientific research back in the day, a lot of that was also in the interest of money, just personal profit more than anything else. Einstein, you could actually argue, was fairly corrupt in his time because he had no problems either stealing ideas from other people or outright persuading other people to give over their research progress and then releasing that himself, right? Just look into Einstein if you want to have an interesting read. But at the end of the day, a lot of corruption comes not necessarily just from, oh, here's a chunk of money, you say this. which again even happens in scientific research, but it also can be in the interests of acquiring money in the future, example being the tenured positions, of course. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's ideological corruption, where specific ideologies infiltrate a group that should not have such ideologies. Again, racism in police forces is a common theme here, that even though it's not financially interested, usually, that's still a form of corruption. Same thing with the military. That's all corruption. Yes, it's racist as well, and a lot of people summarize it as such, but realistically speaking, it's a form of corruption. We're talking about ideological corruption here instead, though, rather than financial corruption. Frankly, there's no real it's ideological corruption is harder to see. This might surprise you, but let's talk about, for example, racism in police forces, right? This is, at this point, fairly well established that there are police forces out there that definitely have some racial bias. But the statistics undersell that, because a lot of the statistics that are used to point this out have been volunteered statistics. In other words, the police forces chose to give those statistics to the FBI, usually, who keeps track of a lot of this. But not all police forces are going to volunteer that information, alright? For the very obvious reason that it's even worse, right? And if it's voluntarily given, then information is going to be a little bit harder to keep track of. The true scope of it is going to be a little bit harder to get at, right? And this also leaves open the really interesting possibility of crimes being fabricated to make the problem either not seem as bad, or crimes being left off to make it not seem as bad. Remember, these are volunteer statistics. What do I mean by left off? Because a lot of people are going to say, well, they have to send over their whole data stores. Sure, but what if a incident never makes it into the records? Say, for example, a officer beats someone. Not to death, they survive. But that is never recorded. Even if the person tries to make a complaint, it's just not put on the books, it's not made an official report, it never hits the data. That beating never existed according to data, according officially. Even if the person says something on, say, social media, alright, where's the evidence? Right? If they're careful about where they're hitting the person, there's not going to be much evidence, if any at all. Right? If an officer confiscates something and that never makes it onto the books or in the records, the report is discarded without going into the records. Person doesn't have the item anymore, and unless they kept the receipt, which most people obviously don't, it never existed. Right? It's so easy for a lot of things to go on and never hit the records that are sent to the FBI. Even if the FBI came in and investigated the records the police force has, if these types of events never hit the records, guess what? The FBI is never going to know. Alright? There are more gruesome things that an officer can do that is never going to hit, or could never hit the books. But we're going to leave those aside, but use your imagination. It's easy. Corruption is easy. Let's just be brutally honest here. Corruption is easy. It's easy to perform. It's easy to get away with. It's taken years for some of these studies to be discovered as having fraudulent data. Why? Because they have to be, because somebody has to be curious enough to replicate that experiment and replicate it enough where they can say with confidence that that couldn't happen in a million years, as an example, right? That takes time. It takes effort, and it takes money. And not a whole lot of people are interested in funding research to prove somebody else wrong, right? That's not something a lot of people are interested in funding. Even if they're really into the honesty thing, right? Not a lot of people are going to be interested in funding that. The police are obviously not going to self-report. Same thing with politicians. No one in their right mind is going to self-report, and a lot of the times, the people who are corrupt are also in a position to get rid of the evidence. I use the police as a really obvious and low-level example, but that is also very possible and absolutely done at higher levels as well. Right? It's easy to be corrupt. Quite frankly, unless you are literally at the bottom of the rung, bottom of the ladder, bottom of the rung, unless you're at the bottom of a ladder of some power structure, corruption is easy. If you're one of the bottom feeders of your power structure, corruption is actually harder to get away with, which is why low-level corruption is not that common. Unless you're doing it in cahoots with someone higher up. But once you get past a certain level of power in specific power structures, it's easy. And it's significantly more common than a lot of people think because, again, it's easy to conceal. There are more corrupt police than a lot of people know or can even prove. At best, there'll be rumors and stories. There's a lot more corrupt politicians than people realize. There's just suspicions and rumors because they are in a position to hide the evidence or get rid of it outright. In fact, the only reason that the Supreme Court justices were discovered taking vacations that they were not reporting is because vacations are not easy to hide. They somehow did it for quite a while, which speaks volumes about how well we're tracking that kind of thing, but, you know, you disappear for a few weeks on a vacation, people are going to notice, right? That's pretty obvious. There's even media corruption, right? Fox News is a great example of a media corporation very clearly, at minimum, ideologically biased. Maybe they're also being paid, but they absolutely have an ideological bias there. Most news organizations do have some sort of ideological bias, let's be really honest, but Fox News is the standout. Corruption is more common than you think it is, and easier to hide than you think it is. Alright? One final note, a lot of people are talking about unions, which is fine, but a lot of people think they're some kind of cure-all. They aren't. Unions are just as open to corruption as anything else is. And I'm not necessarily saying this to be anti-union, because I'm not anti-union. I don't frankly care. unions are overall going to have a positive impact because rather than just the corporation trying to control your life, you've got two different parties trying to control your life, the union on one side and the corporation on the other. But let's not be putting on some sort of idealized filter here. There are no heroes. Heroes are fictional. And unions can be just as corrupt as anyone else can. But then that's true of pretty much everything. Alright? Even content creators can be very corrupt. The whole Temu thing, or companies paying creators to say something positive about whatever. Case in point, Josh Strife Hayes, who plays a lot of MMOs, plays a lot of games in general, was approached by Blizzard and they asked him how much he wanted to promote their game, and he declined because he didn't think it was a good game and didn't think that the messaging was honest. Alright, that's an example of a creator who did the right thing, but he's one in a million, right? How many thousands of creators have taken the money and promoted whatever, right? The whole cryptocurrency fiasco, Save the Kids is a great example, right? The whole Save the Kids nightmare. Anything the Paul brothers do is highly sketchy, obviously. Corruption is rampant, but you don't see a lot of it because it's incredibly easy to hide. But with that positive message, thank you all very much for listening. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.